Wilson Center and to today's meeting. Thank you for coming despite the terrible heat outside. We have, I think we have filled this room to the capacity it can take, and the latecomers will have to go to the 6th floor because we have an overflow, and we will take their questions. We are going to divide today's speakers into two groups. Susan Maloney to my right, and Roberto Toscano. You have their bios, so I'm not going to introduce them. You can take a look at it. We'll discuss the foreign policy challenges of Mr. Rouhani, and then we have Shervin Malikzadeh, who spent the elections in Tehran, so he will have for us a report from the ground with lots of pictures, as he told me, and Ali Vaez and Bijan Khajepur. Bijan has been an old friend, has spoken at the center many times, so we always extend him a special welcome because he never turns us down. Probably everybody was surprised when Mr. Rouhani was elected with a decent majority. But we all expected Mr. Ghalibaf, and originally I had planned this meeting thinking that we will be discussing the challenges that Mr. Ghalibaf is going to face. And then when Rouhani was elected, that came really as a big surprise to all of us. And for the second time, we have a smiling cleric going to be the president of Iran. I think the big difference is that this time we have someone who is an insider, and we should not kid ourselves, really. I mean, he is a part of the regime. He has had every possible position that you can hold in the Islamic Republic, and probably the culmination of his career is going to be his 8-year presidency, and he will be judged by whether he can deliver both on domestic issues and foreign policy. And I'd like to end with an anecdote and give the floor to Shaul Bakhash, who is going to moderate the panel and wrap it up. I spoke to a couple of friends in Tehran over the weekend, and I was told that the atmosphere has changed. And I said, what do you mean by the atmosphere has changed? He said, well, I mean, the way women are dressed, you sometimes find it very difficult to see whether they really are wearing a skimpy headscarf on their head or not. And I said, what do you mean? He said, it's really a piece of very see-through cloth. So that alone will show you the barometer these days in Tehran. How long it will last, we don't know. With this, I would like to give the floor to Shaul, but can I ask you, please, to close your cell phones, your Blackberries, everything, and put up with us for 2 hours without checking your messages, because it interferes with the live webcast, which is picked up around the world. Thank you. Shaul?
Thank you, Hale. As Hale suggested, Rouhani's election has generated considerable excitement in Iran and a great deal of attention abroad among the in the press, among the commentariat and the chattering classes. I think the reception abroad of Rouhani's election has been threefold. There are what you might call the Irano-optimists, who see in his election the possibility of a change in direction, moderation on foreign policy, the possible breakthrough on the nuclear issue, reaching out to the United States and other countries, and an easing of restrictions and a much saner policy economically at home. Then there are, of course, the Irano-pessimists or rejectionists who take the view that Rouhani is one of them, that Iran is made up of a leadership that is of a single cloth, and that his election will make no difference. At the extreme of this position is Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, who said recently that the outgoing President Ahmadinejad is a wolf in wolf's clothing, and Rouhani is a wolf in sheep's clothing. And third, you might say, are the Irano-skeptics who do think Rouhani is well-intentioned and will try to make a difference, but note all the restrictions and the lack of ultimate power that the president in Iran has. Now, to discuss these issues, we have with us an excellent panel. As Holly said, they're known to you, their bios are in the sheets handed out, so I will just move directly to our first speaker, Roberto Toscano, former ambassador of Italy to Iran. Roberto.
Thank you, Shaul. Well, I've been asked to talk about European policy towards Iran. It could be a very short talk if I had to stick to that. You know, I'm sure there are some fellow Europeans in this hall, and maybe they think I'm not respectful enough of our own common endeavor, in which I do believe, I still believe. But when you think about Iran, I'm reminded of something that was happening at the beginning of the nuclear negotiations. One American said, what British said, we apparently reach an agreement with the negotiating team, and then they go back to Tehran, and the supreme leader says no. Well, Europeans always had a supreme leader sitting in Washington. So the final decider was not in Brussels, let's face it. And yet, there was a difference, and an interesting one. At the beginning, when we had the E3 or EU3 stage, the idea was that of talking about the nuclear issue in a wider context. There was something about regional issues. There was something about economic cooperation. And I think that was wise and could become wise again. Why? If you only have one issue on the table, it's a zero-sum game. Either you solve it one way or the other. There is no bargaining chip. There is no give and take. And it's even worse because it's not even the nuclear issue. It's the enrichment. So the object of the negotiation has shrunk so much that it is extremely difficult to address it and to solve it, as negotiations are usually carried out by some concessions, some demands, and so on. But and then there is something else, the nature of sanctions. We now can agree that sanctions have produced a result. The Iranian economy is doing as you know it's doing, and explicitly during the electoral campaign, several candidates have started saying, does it make sense to be intransigent on the nuclear issue when the results are so negative in terms of the economic well-being of the country? But they are useful only if they are instrumental to reaching an agreement which has to be some sort of compromise. There is a bottom line for our side, but there is also a bottom line for the other side. And it's very interesting to know how Rouhani, when he was nuclear negotiator, let's not forget it, was conceiving of that bottom line. The bottom line for the Iranians is the recognition of the right of enrichment, but the availability to be subject to special controls. I'm talking about the additional protocol, which was applied for 2 years, even without having been ratified by the Iranian parliament. And so, under Rouhani, there was suspension, and a suspension that, unfortunately, somebody in the West conceived as a final renunciation of the right of enrichment. And that, I can assure you, that in Iran, not even people who would like the regime to fall would accept that. So, Rouhani, and he even went public, because after he was no longer nuclear negotiator, he sent a letter to Time magazine, which can be read, where he spelled out the way he saw the solution. And the solution was exactly along these terms. Guarantees in the guise of special controls and the recognition of the right of enrichment, because it's also a symbolic need for the national pride, let's put it that way. Face saving. I was told as much by some high official when I was ambassador there. He said, we need some face saving. And there is no doubt that if we insist that since they're bad guys, they have lost the common rights that everybody else has, then I don't think there is a solution. And then sanctions become something else. In that case, if there is no positive end game, sanctions become a stepping stone to conflict, to military conflict. So there are sanctions and there are sanctions. But what we should be really interested in is the internal situation, because a lot depends on that. Two things that Haleh said, the smiling cleric and the insider. Yes, he's a smiling cleric. As a matter of fact, he's not on the same political, let's say, spectrum, the same political position as Khatami. But the way he behaves and talks is not so different. And having met both of them, I can assure you that the style is important, especially if compared to the style of Ahmadinejad. The style in politics makes a lot of difference. As for being an insider, well, I think it's a plus. It's not a minus, because he's one of the few people who can get from the supreme leader the authorization to go along with some more flexible position in international relations, and especially in the nuclear issue. We should ask ourselves, therefore, why did the system allow Rouhani to emerge as the winner? First of all, he was really elected. I don't think we should have any doubt about that. The Iranians elected him with an unexpected shift, especially of the reformists, who thought he was the best of a bad situation. Iranians, I think, proved to be incredibly, let's say, realistic. The choice itself was a choice of reform, of gradual change. The jury is still out. We don't know if this will happen or not, but the system just wants to survive, of course. And there are moments when even a non-democratic system comes to the conclusion that continuation of a certain hard line or repression or denial of the demands that come from society is no longer sustainable. for most of my 40-year career, I worked under the paradigm of the Cold War, and I served in the Soviet Union. So I remember that when Gorbachev was elected, people said, yeah, you know, they're trying another trick. Nothing is going to change. He's a quintessential regime guy. Yeah, of course he was. That's the way he came up. And even more than Gorbachev, one should reflect on the political figure of Andropov. Without Andropov, who was came before Gorbachev and who opened the way to Gorbachev, he was the head of the KGB, definitely not a liberal. And yet, without Andropov, things would have not started moving. So what do you say about that? Yes, the regime wants to survive, but in order to survive, at times they set in motion mechanisms and then lead somewhere else. We don't know. There is nothing that is known in advance. But what we see now in Iran is that a certain dynamic has been set in motion. We should not be overly optimistic, but saying that nothing has happened definitely is not justified. The nuclear issue remains very important, but as I said, there are other very important issues that should not be sacrificed because we only see the nuclear issue. Let's think of what's going on in the Middle East in general, and let's say Syria. You know, Rouhani is not even a president yet. He will start in August. He will be inaugurated in August. But he said certain things that are extremely interesting. Once answering a question on Syria, he said, look, if there are massacres of civilians, we should not distinguish if they're performed by our friends or by our enemies. A massacre is a massacre. Well, he was talking about something that's going on. I think Iran has not decided to go down in a bunker with Assad. If there is a way out, they will find it. But again, a compromise, saving some of their own interest and giving up something else. But you have to negotiate for that. Let's think about Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, there is a coincidence of interest between this country and Iran, as was proved when the US attacked the Taliban and Iran cooperated. There are many different things to explore. And going back to the nuclear, I find it very interesting. I don't happen to be, I usually don't quote Ronald Reagan, but when he said about the Soviet and the nuclear deals, trust but verify. Trust but verify. It sounds interesting, because this is exactly what we should do with the Iranians. And the verification can even compensate for the lack of trust. Something that people really don't know is that IAEA inspections on Iran nuclear sites, declared sites, has never stopped. And it has. Of course, what we want to know is whether something is happening outside the declared nuclear sites. That is what the additional protocol is all about. It's not compulsory. Many countries have not accepted it, but Iran should accept it as a part of a deal. So trust but verify, I think, should be our next stage. It will be very important to see who will enter the cabinet and who will be the next nuclear negotiators. There are some names being mentioned that are extremely interesting. You know, there is a special breed of officials and people in the regime that they're not Western-style liberals, but they hate being backward as a country, isolated. They hate risking a military conflict. They hate having a lousy economy. Usually they were associated with the personality and the political role of Rafsanjani. Rafsanjani was put out of the game because he was too threatening for the power of the supreme leader. But Rouhani is definitely somebody belonging to that political area. And there are a lot of people belonging to that political area who, under Ahmadinejad, were parked in marginal jobs, either in Iran or even sometimes abroad. They went to universities, think tanks. If those guys come back, and I think they will come back, we can see a difference. Because as I said, they're also regime people, but they have suffered very much the humiliation of being a pariah country, a country whose president spoke about the Holocaust denial, which I assure you is not a popular subject in Iran. Iranians are not on that wavelength, and they thought it was a disgrace, the great majority of them. So this idea of having a decent government, a decent economy, and becoming a normal country in foreign relations doesn't make Iran a friend or an ally or a non-problematic country, but definitely it would be a very positive change. I hope that people in this country and also in Europe will try working on this hypothesis and indeed verify it diplomatically. But I think we should do it, and rather quickly.
Thank you very much, Roberto. Susan.
It's on. Wonderful. Thank you so much to Haleh Esfandiari, the Woodrow Wilson Center, and to Shaul Bakhash for moderating this session. I am honored and frankly intimidated to be on a panel of this stature, particularly between two speakers whom I know I would like to hear, and I suspect all of you would like to hear. Ambassador Toscano, who brings the firsthand perspective of his time in Tehran, and Shervin Melekzadeh, whose work during the election was published in The Atlantic and elsewhere, and who brings a multimedia presentation of ground truth and direct experience. You're all of Washington. I've been asked to talk about Washington, and so a lot of what I say, I suspect, will come as no surprise to anyone here. I'll try to be brief so we can get on to those who bring perhaps a new perspective. I'm going to talk about three main areas on this issue. The first is sort of the Washington perspective on what's happened over the course of the past 6 weeks. The second will be some of the challenges that the Rouhani administration will face in dealing with this town and dealing with the range of foreign policy issues that it confronts today. And finally, ending perhaps on a positive note, consistent with the upbeat tone of this period of U.S.-Iran relations. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as perhaps some facilitating conditions for progress. First, in terms of the perspective, I think as you all know, we were caught unaware here in Washington. The administration, if anything, was prepared to be harsh, was prepared to go on the offensive on these elections simply because of the perception of regret over the handling of the 2009 vote count and then the emergence of the Green Movement. This was a kind of Achilles heel for an administration that is still struggling to deal with democratic change around the region. And so the memory and the accusations that had only Obama spoken out more forcefully on behalf of Mousavi, things might have ended very differently, a contention that I don't tend to agree with. I think conditioned the administration and frankly many here in Washington to be really ready to criticize. And you saw it in the initial response to Rafsanjani's rejection by the Guardians Council and his application to run for the elections. And you saw this sort of difficulty almost in pivoting. And I happen to be one of those who testified on before Congress a couple of days after the election in a hearing that was really scoped and characterized by rhetoric that was presuming that in fact it would be most likely a hardline victory of Jalili or possibly someone else of that philosophical perspective. And you saw a sense of almost bafflement and a real, sort of difficulty in adjusting to what was a new situation. Let me also say, though, that I think that many in this town and many within the administration and even many on the Hill we're watching what was happening in Iran very closely. And so it's not to say that, even those who've been critical of the election, even those who are quite dubious of President-elect Rouhani, have disregarded the events that took place in Iran. It was almost impossible to miss, in part because of the changes. When we compare today to 1997, I mean, if anything, we were able to experience so much of what happened in this campaign almost in real time. Many of us watched the debates. So many people in Washington were live tweeting the debates. It was really a remarkable experience. And I think that, in effect, that did permeate among decision makers and policymakers. As Dr. Bakhash said, there is a sort of debate around town between optimists, pessimists, and skeptics. And I'm not sure, I probably fall somewhere in the skeptical range, although I will talk, I hope, in a somewhat positive fashion as I go along here. But I think there are a couple of interpretations of what happened. The first is that, and this is really from the pessimists, that Rouhani is either a dupe or a ploy. He's either a wolf in wolf's clothing, or he's someone who's been put forward, but is going to be like Khatami, a sort of knife without a blade, like Bazargan. Someone who will not have any real authority, someone who's just going to be at the smiling face of a very nefarious regime. There are those who see the available evidence and will make that argument, and I think that while I disagree with them, I understand where that perspective comes from. The second argument is that the regime, which happens to be perhaps on the brink, has blinked, that we did it, that our sanctions have made this happen, and that in effect, were it not for the international pressure, we might well have seen a sort of 2009 redux. And that, in fact, this is really a remarkable affirmation of U.S. strategy, and perhaps we ought to just continue along our merry way and, in fact, increase and intensify pressure and sanctions. And finally, there are those who would argue that, in fact, what happened was a groundswell that took the regime by surprise. And at some point along the way, either as the campaign progressed, or I would argue possibly before the campaign even was launched, the regime itself decided to use this critical juncture of the elections as an opportunity to shift course on key issues, including the nuclear issue. And to what extent you give credit to popular opinion versus an orchestration by factions and an acceptance and a concession by the supreme leader depends on where you stand and where you sit. But I think there's some argument that it was a little bit of both of that final interpretation, that in fact that the role of popular opinion was critical, but as was the role of these shifting factions within the regime itself, and an acceptance and an awareness by the leadership that we couldn't simply go through 2009 all over again, not simply because of the domestic conditions, but because of the regional conditions, because of what was happening in Syria, what was happening in Egypt and elsewhere, raised the level of concern about instability in Iran in a new fashion. Let me just finish on this first set of issues that I want to reinforce. Is there is a real distrust of Iranian moderates in Washington. No one should have any illusions about that, and frankly, it's not wholly unjustified. Some of our most disastrous foreign policy decisions on Iran over the years have been conditioned by this perception that we found them. We found those elusive moderates within the regime. Iran-Contra, for those of you who may have forgotten, was predicated on this notion that if only we funnel these arms and engage in this sort of a dialogue, that in fact we can topple the clerics, little knowing that we were in fact dealing with the clerics, or little accepting that we were dealing with the clerics. So I think this sort of distrust of Iranian moderates has very deep roots. It won't be overcome easily, and it is not inherently contradictory for an administration that does in fact seek to use diplomacy to still have a certain degree of skepticism. In terms of challenges, I want to be very realistic about what we're likely to see in the short term. First, I want to offer a reminder that, in fact, the ideological posture of the Iranian president is not always identical to the Islamic Republic's position on the nuclear issue. And for just a little recollection of that, think back to 2009, the last time we thought we were on the brink of some sort of a negotiated deal with the Iranians on the nuclear issue. In fact, the confidence-building measure that was initially negotiated and later rebuffed ostensibly by the Iranians would say by Washington, was in fact advocated and supported by Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And Rouhani was one of those who came out in public and denounced the deal as selling Iran's patrimony at too cheap a price. There are many of those who dealt with Rouhani when he was in his position as nuclear negotiator, who are, quite happy to see him in the position that he's in, but will also remind us all that he was no pushover in that role. Despite the fact that he was responsible for the one enduring suspension of Iran's enrichment activities, he was a tough customer, and he drove a hard bargain, and he was often very frustrating to deal with across the table. And so, of course, I think there needs to be a degree of realism about what it is, the way that it is he's going to approach these issues. The second big challenge I think Rouhani faces is Syria. And it's not so much that I doubt what Ambassador Toscano has said about the degree to which the regime is unwilling to go down in the bunker with Assad. I tend to agree with that. But Syria is a really dangerous issue. First of all, the Iranians have only limited control over what's happening on a day-to-day basis within Syria. Second of all, Syria is an ideal opportunity for those who oppose Rouhani's efforts to reach out to the world, to improve Iran's position in the world, to undermine that agenda. And by that I mean people within Iran seeking to undermine that agenda. In the same way that hardliners sought to undermine Khatami throughout his presidency by criticizing the sorts of overtures that he made to the Europeans and to the Gulf. It's very possible that there will be those who use Syria as the new version of the espionage trial of the Jews of Shiraz, which did incredible damage to Khatami's reputation here in Washington. One direct implication of Iranian forces in a massacre in Syria will make it incredibly difficult to see any progress on the nuclear issue here. Finally, in terms of challenges, I want to reinforce this whole issue of the sanctions that I know Ali and others are going to speak about, their complexity, the multifaceted nature of the sanctions, and also, frankly, the differing perceptions between Tehran and Washington, or really Tehran and the international community, about the role of sanctions. One of Rouhani's deputies, Hussein Mousavian, who's often been here in Washington, wrote a piece shortly after the election in which he talked about a kind of equal value exchange. We'll give something on the nuclear issue. We want something back of equal value on sanctions. That's not the way that Washington has typically perceived the sanctions. The sanctions are a punishment for Iranian transgressions. They will not be removed until those transgressions have been remediated. That is the perception from here, that this is not an equal bargain, that this is not a transaction between two parties with grievances that have equivalent legitimacy. I'm not endorsing that view. I'm simply reminding those who expect that there may be some dramatic gesture toward the incoming Rouhani administration to appreciate that, in fact, sanctions are held in a very different regard here in Washington. I also simply want to say that I think irrational exuberance is as dangerous as denial with respect to Rouhani. Those who are expecting these sort of big sanctions relief are creating these expectations, particularly among the Iranian people, that are only going to be disappointed when and if we don't see on August 4th some sort of dramatic gesture from Washington. And frankly, I don't think we can expect to see it, given, as I said, the sort of distrust of Iranian moderates. We need to appreciate, as I think Rouhani himself does, at least in what he's said so far, that this is going to be a long and incremental and likely arduous process. We also have to appreciate that particularly a Democratic administration remembers that rewarding Iran simply on the basis of internal change, the sort of sanctions relief that was put forward after the Majlis elections in 2000 produced very little reciprocity and actually undercut the very people we were trying to support on the Iranian side. And that will also play into how the administration responds. Let me just wrap up with what I think are a few facilitating conditions to give a more positive spin to what I think is possible here. First, I think Rouhani is actually an extraordinary individual at an extraordinary moment for Iran. And it's been a long time since we could say that. He's creative, he's bold, he's a guy who wrote the most interesting memoir in the recent political history. He wrote to Time magazine even after he was being turned into a kind of persona non grata on the nuclear issue. He is really a very interesting individual all the more interesting in the fact that as I looked through my own pretty decent library of English language work on Iran in the past 20 years, Rouhani almost never features into it, with the exception of his role on the nuclear issue. Here's a man who played a major role in the war, who's been 5 terms in the Iranian parliament, and he almost doesn't feature in our own understanding of what happened in Iran. Clearly, this is a sort of disconnect between what's happening, the way this country is governed, and our ability to recognize it. In that respect, I think it's very exciting to see him come into this position that he's in. The other sort of facilitating conditions from the Iranian side are these shifts. The fact that you saw the reformists and moderates come together, that wasn't accidental. It was the product of an enormous amount of coordination for months leading up to the election, and it really came as a surprise to many. It's the end of the Ahmadinejad era, and that has to be a positive for Iran and for the world. Finally, look at what's happening here within this administration in Washington. You have an administration that's launching a major bid to resume negotiations on the Middle East peace process, an administration that has demonstrated it is highly unwilling to start another war or to provoke or to get engaged in another crisis in the Middle East. I think there are a lot of difficulties to be worked out, but I do think that this is an administration that does want to use diplomacy to resolve the nuclear issue. And finally, I think we may actually have a partner on the Iranian side who sees it the same way. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm going to open up the floor to questions on the foreign policy issues, and then we will address the domestic side of the Rouhani. Yes, please.
They have to identify
Yes.
themselves and wait for the mic.
Thank you very much. Nikankosarkhodnevis.org. My question is that did anyone here listen to what Mr. Khamenei said yesterday? And because we don't hear anything about his role in actually putting a big block on negotiations. Thank you.
Yeah, I think what he said, I just saw a short take, but he said we should not be afraid of negotiating, but we have to be very careful. I mean, that's not much, but it's not far from what Rouhani is saying. As Suzanne just said, Rouhani is a tough negotiator, so we cannot expect, an easy path. But the idea that it is possible to negotiate is a good starting point.
But let me push you on that. Some people argue that Khamenei is a man who really not only doesn't believe that a deal is possible with the United States, but that doesn't want one. And I can go through the reasons.
One has to start by interpreting what Khamenei's real goal is. Is it to conquer the world for Islam? No, it is not. Is it to become a North Korea with nuclear weapons and total isolation? It is not. It is that of having the regime survive, which whatever political model it takes. The revolution started with radicalism at the beginning. They were almost Trotskyites. They wanted to spread the revolution after 79 to the whole. They understood that was not possible. So Rafsanjani came in. A normal country, a normal economy, more or less. And it was allowed because that was the need. And then somebody thought, well, we need some reform, not too much, but we need some reform. So get me Khatami. And Khatami came and did change certain things, but did not change the substance of the regime, which once knew. Then, given the resentment of the Iranian common people, and not only Iranian common people, towards elites, let's have some populism. Hey, Ahmadinejad. And it worked and it didn't work. Now it's another stage. The purpose hasn't changed, the stage has changed. What I'm saying is that this stage, which is represented by Rouhani, could be interesting both for Iranians who can live better and for us who can spare us another world crisis.
Shal, can I say one sentence
Yes.
about that? Sorry, just one sentence. If we take Khamenei's words seriously, then we should take all of his speech seriously. He said, and he repeated it a couple of times, he said the highest priority for Iran at this stage, using the word from Roberto, this stage, is economic and scientific progress. Rouhani is the type of person, as Suzanne said correctly, who would go to Khamenei and say, well, if this is the highest priority, then we need to de-escalate our external relations, because otherwise we cannot progress economically and scientifically. This is important. Take all the words seriously.
Good. Take a question here, please.
Thank you. Benjamin Tua, no affiliation. How significant is the recent letter by, I think, some 137 members of the House of Representatives to President Obama, encouraging him to engage Iran? And the letter includes what would seem to be a meaningful number of Republicans.
I think it is a nice gesture. I think when you have only 1/3 of the House, 1/4 of the House of Representatives supporting the current policy, which is, of course, already diplomacy, I don't see it as a sort of ringing endorsement for any dramatic shift in U.S. policy. I think if it offers again, a kind of facilitating condition. I've seen reports that the Iranian parliament may take it up if it creates the kind of dialogue that we saw, frankly, back during the reform era, where both parliaments were talking about parliamentary exchanges and that sort of thing. Terrific. But I don't think it in any way undercuts the almost universal support on the Hill for maintaining and even intensifying pressure on Iran in the absence of a deal. I do want to just say a word to Nika Hang's comment about Khamenei, because I think it's important, and it's hard, we spend a lot of time talking about the Iranian presidency until we all acknowledge that there are limitations to it, and that ultimately Iran's real authority is Ayatollah Khamenei. I've spent the past few weeks sort of wondering, how did we not see this coming, particularly when, as you pull together a lot of the evidence in the aftermath, you can see, in fact, these trends. The factional debate, the efforts to coordinate, the failure on the part of the conservatives to come together in the same fashion. Part of the reason we didn't see Rouhani coming is because Khamenei had denounced him so publicly and so personally for his role on the nuclear issue. And I think that, we can't forget that this is not a one-man system. It's not a one-man Rouhani system. It's not a one-man Khamenei system. There is nothing guaranteed on the Iranian side. What we have, though, is, I think, a better set of conditions today than we had 4 years ago or 8 years ago.
Question here.
Trudy Rubin, the Philadelphia Inquirer. I'd like to ask Suzanne and Ambassador Toscano, the military threat is presented by many people as essential to convince the Iranians they have to get serious. So first of all, is the threat of military force at this point, do you think, a plus or a minus in moving talks forward? And secondly, in Israel, the military threat has been justified extensively by referring to the apocalypticism of Ahmadinejad. With him gone, how do you assess, was that an Ahmadinejad thing, pushing that Mahdiist philosophy? Do you see that kind of language disappearing? Do you think that it was and is vastly overestimated by the Israelis?
Well, the paradox is the apocalyptic theological approach was not of the clergy, but of somebody who didn't belong to the clergy like Ahmadinejad. The clergy can be more cynical at times or more realistic, more divided, but definitely not very apocalyptic. Also because the very system that started with the 79 revolution is not apocalyptic in the sense that Khomeini, I'm not a Shia theologian, but I think was rather heretical by saying that even before the Mahdi comes back, there can be such a thing as an Islamic State, which doesn't coincide with the Orthodox Shia theory, according to which there is no way in which a state can be Islamic until the 12th Imam comes back. You can only diminish the evils by exerting a certain influence on political power, as it happens in Iraq. The Shia clergy in Iraq with Sistani is the Orthodox version. Anyway, but apart from that, I must say that I don't see 1 ounce of apocalypticism in Rouhani, and I don't think anybody sees that. In a way, you know, I like coming from Italy, a Catholic country. I see a lot of parallels between the Shia clergy and the Catholic Church. It can change. The only real goal is surviving as an institution. It's not necessarily, you know, right wing or left wing or whatever it takes. So after a German theologian, we have a Latin American populist. So what? I think the Iranian clergy is on the same wavelength.
On the war issue?
I've never seen a constructive role to making threats with respect to the Iranian nuclear issue. The Iranians understand, the world understands, and the president has committed that Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. In the absence of specific conditions or red lines that we are prepared to enforce, reiterating that kind of vague threat, I don't see any genuine value, particularly now when we at least have the prospect of a negotiating team that is more competent and more ready to engage in a serious way. Those folks need to sit in a table at a conference room in some European or Middle Eastern or Central Asian capital and do the business of diplomacy, which is unpleasant and messy and time-consuming. They don't need to be dealing with the kind of headline-grabbing moments of rhetoric that invokes war. And I think that it would be exactly the wrong time to engage in that sort of theatrics.
Shaul, can I just add a little thing about Israel? I was reading yesterday that apparently Israel has a long-range missile called Jericho, as well as nuclear submarines in the Indian Ocean, which give Israel second strike capability. Second strike capability means that even if somebody attacks you, you have the possibility of a devastating retaliation. I think that should a little bit de-dramatize the situation, or not. I don't know, but I've studied nuclear strategy at the times of the Cold War. That's the way it worked.
Okay, question there, please. Yes.
Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council and allmonitor.com. Lovely to see you all. Ambassador Toscano and Suzanne, in addition to the calls for the military option to be reinforced, we also hear a lot of concern about, you know, Rouhani, wolf in sheep's clothing. Iran is going to move toward a bomb. It's going to break out. Now we're told it's going to break out by the middle of next year. I've seen some studies that suggested this would be possible. What's your sense of how Iran is going to play in terms of its nuclear program? Is it going to continue to sort of make a little more 20% uranium and then shunt it aside for possible fuel for the Tehran research reactor? Would you anticipate any provocative steps by the Iranians, or do you think they'll kind of slow things down while the negotiations proceed?
You know, I agree with the American intelligence establishment saying that the regime has not decided to go for the bomb. But I think they have decided to acquire the capability of building a bomb. And that you cannot unlearn. The important thing is to see what is the limit to the enrichment and to the facility. But the intention, I don't think, has been to build a bomb, but to be capable of doing it if it becomes necessary. Even Japan said something to that effect. We didn't need the bomb, but in case we can make it in 6 months. That is the more realistic scenario.
Okay, question here in black dress.
Angie Ahmadi, Eurasia Foundation. My question is for Ms. Maloney. Well, you ended your analysis quite positively, but the body of analysis was kind of had this negative sense. And you underlined the distrust of Iranian moderates, and you called Rouhani a tough customer. So I was wondering, how would it be if a negotiator is pushing for his country's national interest? Would that be a tough customer? Because tough is a vague term to use, so I don't know if you meant it negatively or positively, but I was wondering if Washington's perceptions are going to shift towards a more realistic position towards Iran and its nuclear issue. Thank you.
Well, I would be tempted to turn the question back to you and ask what a more realistic position toward the Iranian nuclear issue is, because I think, in fact, if you probe and if you have an opportunity to speak with the folks within the U.S. government or those who've recently departed who deal with the nuclear issue, they have a pretty realistic understanding. And they are, in many cases, more eager than anyone to get a deal on this. I would point to an article published by my newest colleague, Robert Einhorn, who sat across the table from the Iranians in all of the negotiations that have taken place during the Obama administration tenure, and has called for a shift. There is this debate about whether or not sort of small-scale confidence-building measures, incrementalism on the nuclear issue, is a more viable way to approach this challenge, or whether we ought to be going big and sort of showing the end of the rainbow. That is a debate, I think, among professional analysts and scholars of the nuclear issue that I see both sides of. We've been trying incrementalism. It hasn't gotten us very far. I think if there are opportunities to, as Einhorn has argued, marry incrementalism to a more ambitious, not grand bargain, but more comprehensive approach to the nuclear issue, that would be very valuable. But what we have yet to see is what the Iranians are willing to do and what they're looking for, because if you talk to those who've been at the negotiations, up until now, it has been a very difficult, problematic set of exchanges that hopefully will all change with a different set of players on either side of the table. But no one should look at this election as itself a change in Iran's approach to the nuclear issue. We saw during the campaign an incredible debate, not just during the debate, but also during the course of the campaign, and much of it pushed by Rouhani, and also echoed during the televised debate by people like Ali Akbar Velayati and others, in a way that I think has been very important for Iran. But we have to see whether or not that's going to be translated into a willingness to come to the table, for example, and actually be ready to deal on the 20% enrichment issue, which is something Iranian officials have said publicly, but apparently when they were sitting in negotiations, balked at actually engaging on. So, we really can't make predictions until both sides are sitting at the table.
I know there are many more questions, but I want to move to we can come back to foreign policy issues during the last question period. We'll now move on to the domestic side, and we'll begin with Ali Baez, who will speak to some of the domestic challenges facing Rouhani.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back at the Wilson Center. I guess my talk is going to be a segue from foreign to domestic, because I'm going to focus on roadblocks for nuclear diplomacy and sanctions relief. And I was thinking, Shaul, in which category I should put myself, 3 categories that you outlined. It's often said that pessimist is simply a well-informed optimist. And I still want to put myself in the camp of optimists. And I really believe that with Dr. Rouhani, there is real opportunity for gaining some positive momentum for not resolving, but maybe at least trying to de-escalate the nuclear crisis. However, I think some degree of realism is necessary because one of the main reasons of failure in the past has always been the fact that the two sides had completely misguided expectations of one another. In that sense, I want to talk about three roadblocks, which incidentally all start with three R's. Right to enrichment, reciprocity, and reversibility. The question of right to enrichment has been Iran's perennial bottom line during the past 11 years, independent of which government was in place and independent of who was negotiating. And I expect that it will remain so. And I don't want to get into this technical discussion about if such a right really exists in the NPT or not. It has been debated ad nauseum. And you know, the reality is the NPT is vague about this. So this is a classic case that there are no facts, there are only interpretations. From the Western perspective, when you talk to US and EU officials, they usually outline several problems with recognizing Iran's right to enrichment. Number one is, they say, the NPT has not specified this question, so why should we? Because specifying something that is ambiguous will set some kind of precedent. The precedent, especially for regional countries. How can we go back to the UAE, for example, and tell them, please don't enrich when we're giving Iran an explicit green light to have enrichment on their soil? Second issue is a premature recognition of Iran's right to enrichment might result in difficulties down the road of imposing caps and limits to the scale and the scope of the program. Third problem is that you still have the IAEA, which has a lot of problems with Iran and can't give a green light saying that Iran's nuclear program is purely peaceful. So how can you recognize a dual-use technology under these circumstances? And finally, you know, it's the UN Security Council resolutions that demand a suspension of enrichment. The problem is the Iranians have put themselves in a rhetorical corner when it gets to this. It has been consistently, as I said, the bottom line. And even when Western officials say, you know, we recognize that Iran has the right to peaceful civilian nuclear energy, Ayatollah Khamenei often likes to repeat that it's just a question of one word, and that word is enrichment. So this is going to be a problem, but I think it's not a problem without solution. I'm actually a little bit more optimistic about resolving this problem than the other two, because with pragmatism that we know Dr. Rouhani for, I think there are two ways around this. One is that the question, the can be simply kicked down the road. They can say, let's move on with a confidence building step on the issue of 20%, and then leave this contentious issue of 20% for somewhere down the road. That's one way. So, you know, they will not allow the question of right to enrichment to stymie the whole process. The other solution, which I think is a better solution, is to go for an implicit rather than an explicit recognition of Iran's right to enrichment, which basically means that the two sides agree on the outlines of an end state agreement in which Iran can enrich without specifically saying it, but you know, certain number of centrifuges capped at a certain level of enrichment. And I think my understanding of the position of Rouhani and the team around him is that this is probably more attractive for them, because it will allow them to score an early political victory domestically, and it will open their hand going forward. The second contentious issue, I would say, is reciprocity, and the fact that it means two very different things to both sides, as Suzanne mentioned. Let's start with the issue of 20%, which my understanding is when talks resume, the P5+1 is going to basically start where they left off in Almaty. So it's still going to be on the question of 20%. Now, 20% to the P5+1 is a confidence-building step. It's nothing more than that. It doesn't merit significant sanctions relief. At the same time, it's starting to lose its value because the West is now equally concerned about Iran's 5% enrichment, about Iran's advanced centrifuges, most dangerous of all, about the heavy water reactor in Iraq. The view from Tehran is 20% is actually one of our most valuable assets. Why? Because it's something that the West really cares about. It's perilously close to weapons-grade fissile material. And also, as a former Iranian official told me, because every gram of 20%, if you take into account the impact of sanctions, has cost Iran hundreds of millions of dollars. So they're not going to give it away for sanctions relief that doesn't include oil and financial restrictions. Now, again, I think there are solutions around this. It's not, it's a little bit more difficult probably from the previous issue, and people might disagree on this, but I think there are two ways. If you take the Almaty package, there are two ways going forward. One is that you can go for less, meaning that Iran would accept petrochemical and gold sanctions relief, which is something less than it expects. And in return, the P5+1 also expects Iran to do less on 20%. So let's say just stop 20% enrichment or just mothball Fordo, nothing more than that. The other option, which again I think is a better option, is to go for more, which basically means, and I think Rouhani has already signaled in that direction, that in addition to the issue of 20%, Rouhani adds, and the new team adds, the issue of transparency or enhanced safeguards. And in return, they expect to get sanctions relief on oil and financial restrictions. Now, I think this is also probably more attractive to the P5+1 because honestly, it's easier to sell to domestic audiences. But it will not resolve the whole issue. We should always remember that the issue of transparency is useful, but as an EU official said, Iran can very transparently move towards nuclear weapons. And that's why thickening the line between capability and nuclear military capability is a priority for the West. Now, that leads me to the third problem, which is reversibility. And with that, I want to talk about sanctions, because we often have great ideas about what should be put on the table in terms of nuclear concessions from Iran, but when it gets to sanctions, we're all general and we don't talk about the details. The problem now is that if you look at the sanctions regime that is currently in place, it's such an intricately woven and extensive spider web. It's extremely difficult to untangle. Just look at US sanctions. There are 16 executive orders, 9 acts of Congress. If you look at these 25 sanctions, you'd realize that not all of them are tied to the nuclear issue. At least 88% of them, according to my count, are also related to Iran's foreign policy and domestic policies. Now, of course, the president has the power of revoking some of the executive orders. The problem is almost 60% of them have now been codified by Congress, and these are the ones that matter. These are the ones that are hurting Iranians. The standard for lifting congressional sanctions is extremely high. I'll just give you an example of the major sanctions legislation against Iran, the Iran Sanctions Act. It has 3 requirements. One is that the president should certify to Congress that Iran has ceased efforts to design, develop, and acquire nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, and has stopped its ballistic missile program. Number two, it has been removed from the US list of states sponsor of terrorism, which in itself requires the president to testify that Iran has not supported any terrorist activity in the past 6 months, and has provided assurances that it will not do so in the future. And the third condition is that Iran doesn't pose any threats to the US national security interest and that of its allies. So I think that makes it clear that as long as there is no major significant reorientation in Iran's domestic and foreign policy, I think we're not going to see significant removal of sanctions. It's simply not in the cards. What's possible is suspension, and for that the president can use his waiver power. But let me give you an example. Imagine Iran comes to the table, next round of talks, September, October, with a package that merits sanctions relief related to oil. Well, that would require President Obama to revoke one executive order, and I'm sorry for all the acronyms and numbers, Executive Order 13622. He has to use a 120-day waiver, national security waiver, on the National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA of 2012, to allow states to maintain or increase their level of imports from Iran. 180-day waiver to permit financial transactions with Iran's energy, shipping, and port sectors, which are all declared entities of proliferation under the NDAA 2013. 120-day waiver on Iran Threat Reduction Act, which bans repatriation of Iran's oil revenue to the country. 180-day waiver under Iran Threat Reduction and NDAA 2013 to allow provision of insurance and reinsurance for shipping Iranian oil. The icing on the cake, and this multi-layered cake, is that almost all major Iranian oil and shipping companies have been blacklisted multiple times under multiple different executive orders and designations by the Treasury Department. And you can't just delist a company for 6 months and then put it back on again after 6 months. So some people argue maybe the best scenario is to go for EU sanctions because they're more elastic. They don't have a clear criteria for termination. People often forget that removing EU sanctions requires consensus, which I think Ambassador Toscano can attest that it's not always a straightforward enterprise in Europe. And additionally, there's now so much overlap between US and EU sanctions, then unilateral EU removal of sanctions wouldn't really change much. Let me give you an example. If you take SWIFT sanctions, which are financial messaging sanctions, the EU put them in place in March 2012. At that time, there was no US equivalent. Well, now there is, under the Iran Threat Reduction Act. So even if the Europeans remove their sanctions on SWIFT, which has majority board members Americans, nothing is going to change on the ground. And also, I think maintaining EU sanctions in place, removing EU sanctions but maintaining US sanctions in place will send the wrong signal to Tehran that this is just a tactical ploy for the US sanctions to remain in place indefinitely. I'm sorry if this is too much of a gloomy picture, but these are the realities that I think that the Iranians should also take into account. And if they come to the negotiating table with a more realistic understanding and maybe a more specific demand of sanctions relief, I think it could be more constructive. There are other things that could be done even in the space that we have now between now and the next round of negotiations. I would suggest to the incoming administration in Tehran that even slowing down of the rate of 20% production or increasing the rate of conversion of 20% to fuel rods or suspending some of the activities in Iraq. These will all send very powerful signals and are not necessarily very costly. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Hani. We turn next to, you're going to go next, right?
Yes, sir.
Yes, and you've been to Iran, you were there during the election, so I think you have a lot of interesting things to tell us and show us. Go ahead.
The real story about me being in Iran is I get to eat a lot. My family took very good care of me, so this is almost secondary, this part of it. But so the question I was asked when I got to Iran, I arrived about 2 weeks before the election, was, you came here to do what? Came here to vote? So I was asked this question many times by friends, by strangers. You know, I'd gone there to vote, to observe. You know, I was sort of a source of entertainment, I think. People thought I was crazy. Why would you come all the way to Iran to vote? And this for me was nothing new. You know, I'd heard the same question repeatedly. I'd been there in 2009. This is my grandmother and I, me during my graduate school days with a questionable hair, I think. So, you know, but in 2009, being asked that question, I didn't take it seriously because there was this great enthusiasm and excitement for voting. You know, we forget now, before there was a green movement, there was a green wave. And this green wave also encompassed, I think, supporters of individuals like Rezai and Ahmadinejad. You know, the sort of civic celebration that was public out in the streets, open-air discos, I described it at the time. You know, people really enthusiastic about the possibility of change, or in the case of Ahmadinejad, supporting their candidate. This sort of enthusiasm or excitement did not exist this time around. It was very evident when I arrived that, you know, there's a sort of great despondency, even depression, I think, in the air. The election was shaping up when I arrived, and this is a bit selfish for me to say, perhaps, but an uneventful, uninspiring, perhaps even boring affair. You know, elections in Iran are in many ways the inverse of elections here. You know, there's a great push for turnout. For months, you hear about the duty of the citizens to go and vote. For months and weeks, this is the main thing you hear. And you only find out about the candidates just before the election, let's say a month or two before. I mean, there's discussion of who's going to run, but you know, the actual campaigning is very short and abbreviated, and you know, perhaps people in the U.S. would appreciate that. But you know, here's a sign, a very large sign that was in Inqilab, Meidun Inqilab, Revolutionary Square. The Supreme Leader Khamenei is reminding us that voting, not only is voting a holy duty, but picking well is a holy duty as well. You know, and the point for the regime, as many of you know, for the system, is that turnout signals or indicates a show of strength, a defiance of the enemy, specifically of the U.S. And I'm not sure if this is clear here in this image, but that's Uncle Sam smushed by, you know, the famous fingerprint that you have to, you know, the indication that someone has voted. It oddly looks like a missile. I'm not sure what that signifies, but you know, and it's this idea of national solidarity. Here are the people marching forward into the future. This is in Valias Square, another major square in Tehran. That, interestingly enough, this image recapitulates Moses parting the Red Sea. I'm not sure if that was on purpose or on accident, but you see the great waves enveloping. So,
Even says that in Persian.
yeah, that's right. Our presence will cut through the ocean. So, our persistence, I should say. So, you know, if the question in 2009 was, where is my vote? This is after the election, obviously. You know, that had become, why should I bother to vote? How will I know that my vote will be counted? And what I found was, you know, in that first week that I was there in Iran, there were many who honestly didn't know what to do. They were really upset and angry about 2009. Rafsanjani had been their great hope, but those hopes, as already was mentioned, were dashed when he was denied a presence on the ballot. So people were torn. I mean, there was a real debate going on in Iran with open eyes. Should we vote? Should we not vote? People didn't want to vote as a way to protest. They wanted to protest by not voting, but they also realized, I think a lot of individuals, that not voting was not a plan, and it could possibly make things worse. In other words, that Jalili could come to power, which would have been, I think, a catastrophe for many Iranians. So there's this feeling of great anguish in Iran. So that's what I want to talk about today. You know, what I would hear is, won't vote, won't matter. How do we go from this despondency, from this to this, right? 2 weeks later, the celebration, the exuberance, basically a week of me not sleeping. Because as many of you will know or recall, Iran managed to get into the World Cup 2 days later. So all the people who were upset about Rouhani winning came out on Tuesday, I think it was. And I think Iranians around the world were celebrating for about 3 or 4 days. So, you know, this idea of change finally occurring, how did Iran manage to get to this point? in just 2 weeks, because everything happened so quickly. So I think the explanation of 2013 begins with a series of 3 debates. These are very grueling. I'm impressed that anybody bothered to watch them over here, because we were dying in Iran. I mean, they're 4 hours with 8 candidates. It was brutal. And it became fashionable to deny that you watched, right? A lot of people are like, I'm not going to bother with that. But you go out in the streets, you go to the florist, get your hair cut, go to the corner grocery, and you would overhear people talking about the debates. It's my understanding about 60 or 70% of the population, I don't have the exact precise figures, but they watched at least parts of it. So people were paying attention. And the final debate was on Friday, June 7th. And this last debate was pretty much a catastrophe, I think, for Ghalibaf, who at that point was the clear front runner. And there's polling that indicates he saw a precipitous decline in his numbers after this debate. So the next day I had the opportunity to attend Rouhani's rally at Shahid Shirudi Sports Complex, which is right across from the U.S. Embassy. He was kicking off his final week of campaigning, and here we are packed in this gymnasium, this wrestling arena, a sweaty, packed, chaotic affair, lots of pushing and shoving. If you can imagine a room with 12,000 of your best friends packed in with you and 1,000 waiting to get in outside. This, for me personally, was the first indication that something was going on. That mood of despondency or depression that I described earlier was shifting, and the ground was starting to shift, and that events were racing against, those of us, the so-called Iran experts. So you had this crowd in this arena, hopelessly young, and this was the first thing I noticed right away. I mean, probably 18 to 20 years old. In other words, individuals who were not old enough to vote in the last election probably had seen brothers and sisters out in the streets, perhaps getting hit with batons or worse, parents who had been disappointed by the last election. Now they show up at this arena and they're chanting on their own. They're coming up with their own chants. There's sort of a bottom-up exuberance. For me, the question was, why? How is this happening, right? I didn't expect this at all. So what I saw were echoes of 2009, of the excitement that surrounded the Mousavi campaign then. Here's Rouhani's symbol, of course, was the key. Here's the key in the mosh pit. They had created this sort of papier-mâché key, or like a beach ball, in the stadiums. They were passing that around. And for me, the crowd, or the chants were sort of self-forming. They weren't led very much unlike what later on I would see a Ghalibaf rally, which was a very disciplined, top-down, coordinated, stage-handled affair. At the Rouhani campaign was this sort of youthful exuberance, and the chants were sort of forming from the crowds themselves. A lot of protest songs, a lot of chants calling for a coalition. There in Farsi I've written Salam bar Hashemi, Durud bar Rouhani, and then clap, clap, clap. Durud bar Khatami, Salam bar Rouhani. So they're calling for a coalition. They were asking Aref, the other reformist candidate, to step aside. And of course, there were these more sort of perhaps more political comments about political prisoners being released. So, what I witnessed there was a conversation, or a call and response almost, between the crowd and their chosen or favorite candidate, Rouhani. And these are quotes by Rouhani here at the speech. And I think that this speech that he makes at Shahid Shirudi will go down as one of the more important speeches that he made during the campaign, if not one of the most important speeches we'll hear in the last several years. My interpretation of Rouhani's comments were that he was taking the framework, the sort of revolutionary framework, or the discourse of the revolution, and within that framework, redefining what it meant, for example, to stand up to the U.S., to be defiant against the enemy. We don't need to be belligerent. We don't need to be hostile. There are other ways. There are better ways. I mean, if the end purpose is to preserve the integrity of Iran, Rouhani was describing or explaining a new and better, more peaceful way, perhaps, of doing this. And again, for me, what's interesting about this conversation is clearly he's doing this to get their vote. So who is shaping whom, right? Where is the discussion beginning and where is the discussion or conversation ending? Between the crowd and their candidate, or the candidate leading the crowd? And I think what we're seeing here in Iran is a shift from this notion that we need to have a hero or a leader or an elite take us into the future, and more of a sort of cooperative experience between an electorate and a particular candidate. Just one final note, that middle quote for me was the most powerful, I think. This idea moving away from the use of the shaheed, the families of the martyrs. His description that those days were a duty, but implying that we need to move on to a new sort of rhetoric, revolutionary rhetoric. He also emphasized national unity. This was a big part of his campaign speech and rhetoric. You had these young individuals, dressed in indigenous garb, Turk, Baluch, Lor, Arab. This idea that men and women are equal, these different ethnicities are equal, and he says explicitly, we need everybody. One party can't govern. We need everybody's help, everybody who's qualified. So this was his rhetoric. And again, for me, it's not important so much if he's sincere or not, if he's manipulating the crowd or not. He's a politician, right? The point is that this rhetoric is being formed in response to a need. I think this is a very important dynamic to pay attention to. Okay, so slight tangent, but an important one, I think. The visual experience of the 2013 election, I think, was more about the city council elections, which for the first time were being held concurrently with the presidential elections. And of course, this was done to boost turnout. Particularly in the provinces, these elections are very important, but in Tehran, they're also important because it's from this council, these 31 individuals who are elected, that the mayor of the city is picked. So 900 candidates were running for 31 posts. I can't exaggerate to you how festooned or covered Tehran was with these really amazing and slightly ridiculous posters of various candidates. It was really overwhelming. There's Rezai mixed in with the bunch. But everywhere you went for a week at least, there were these posters, people sort of describing or proclaiming their expertise and their legitimacy to be on the city council. Lots of images of the future, usually used with the Borj Milad. This guy, with the cool young guy gesture, I guess. Hand under the chin seemed to be very popular. You saw that several times. I don't know if you can see his image, the ghostly image of him, the profile in the background. It's one of those 80s pictures we used to get when we were kids. It was very difficult, obviously, to pick from 900 candidates, so you would see a lot of these sort of posters, party lists, right? Usually endorsed by a particular presidential candidate. There, again, Rezai endorsing, waving, I guess, and, supporting these 31 individuals. Or people would distinguish themselves with their trade. So this individual is, trumpeting how he's an engineer. This individual is emphasizing his ability as a pilot. He famously, right, he landed a Iran airplane with the front wheels had gone out. I think a couple years ago, right? Yeah. Yeah. So he decided to remind people by kind of obviously dressing in his profession. And so being an athlete proved to be very successful. This was another way of getting elected. Being an Olympic medalist, Rezazadeh was famously the strongest man on earth. I think a couple Olympics ago. He, I think, came in 4th in the elections. I rode the train out to Karaj, a suburb of Tehran. I found this on the train. It was thrown on the ground, so he's describing himself. He's got his sunglasses in his hand. He's walking towards the viewer. Capable city with a successful engineer. And just in case you have any doubt, he'll give you a free 10 minutes or 10 hours of internet. So this is campaigning, right? This is, on the ground campaigning that's going on. Okay, back to the election. So, on June 10th, RF withdraws from the campaign. Khatami writes him a letter, asks him to step aside. And then on June 11th, you have the endorsement, and this is a very critical moment, endorsement of Hashemi and Khatami for Rouhani. These flyers started to appear all over Tehran. Okay, and so, the day after the vote was on June 14th. On June 15th, everybody was sitting around. Unlike 2009, they really took their time. The vote results were trickling in. There was a lot of calling back and forth between, myself, family, friends in Tehran, what's going to happen. But it was pretty clear by noon what was about to happen. And you can see from this map that, Rouhani wins pretty uniformly across the country. Khuzestan goes to Rezai. There are corners in the upper right corner, northeast corner, Mashhad, and Khorasan, I believe that goes to Ghalibaf, right? But for the most part, this was a pretty clear victory for Rouhani. His numbers in Tehran were depressed, but Tehranis didn't show up to vote. and I'll talk about that more in a second, in the first round, though I think a lot of them were very regretful about that. So of course this leads to, as continuation of the pictures I had at the beginning, this jubilation, Ahmadi bye-bye, Ahmadi bye-bye. And we heard this in 2009, but this time it was for real. Again, I was looking at the videos. I didn't think I'd have time to show the videos, but I can't exaggerate how happy people were. I mean, I was walking between Valley As Street and Meiduna Haftatir and Pola Karim Khan, the Karim Khan Bridge. So those of you who are familiar with Tehran will know those parts of the city. It's in the center, just packed. People brought out their sound systems. There was a lot of dancing in the streets, guys with guys, also guys with girls. But what was fascinating about that night was, Rouhani's name was heard maybe 20% of the time by my estimate. I think about 80% of the cheers and chants I heard were directed back towards 2009. So shouts for Mousavi, shouts for Karoubi, this idea that their vote was finally claimed back. Where is my vote? My vote, your vote was claimed finally 4 years later. Okay, so just to wrap up. So it's always interesting, for me, when I'm in Iran, to look back over this side of the water and see what people are saying. And, as was mentioned earlier, there was a lot of questioning whether this was a legitimate election, whether this was real, or we're going to see more of the same, wolf in sheep's clothing, et cetera, this sort of stuff. And what's missing for me in these quotes that I've put up here are the 37 million who bothered to vote, the 73%, I believe. Above all, the 18 million who voted for Rouhani. It's as if their say or their participation didn't exist, right? What's interesting is we heard similar things on the Iranian side. I don't want to mislead you. There were many Iranians. I went and got my hair cut. I don't know why hair is such a big part of my talk today, but I went and saw this barber. I'd seen him 4 years ago, and he started right away. He started telling me about how this was just a game of chess. Those of you who work on Iran, well, this is sort of familiar rhetoric. Khamenei had planned this out to get a cleric back into power. And of course, naive me, I'm arguing back, no, this was for real. People were out there. There was great enthusiasm. Got in a cab. Cab drivers are great for this sort of stuff as well, I guess. This was a matarsag. this is a scarecrow. And he took it even deeper. He said, this is the British and the Americans controlling everything in Iran. So, I'm an idiot. I argue with them. How do you argue with conspiracy theorists? You can't, right? So a lot of Tehranis, didn't vote. And they said it didn't matter, but a lot of them had voter's remorse, what I'd call it. I heard this a lot, but if I had voted, I would have voted for Rouhani. In other words, if it'd gone to the second round, they would have shown up. Okay, so let me do the poli-sci stuff, the analysis here. What does all this mean? How do I understand this election? It's my humble opinion, I guess. So 3 points. The first is unpredictability. This election could have gone any number of directions. One of my advisors, Farid Afar, he really emphasizes this. When I arrived on June 4th, Ghalibaf was at 35%. There was daily tracking polls going on by IPOS. Rouhani was at 7%. He was up from a mere 3%. I think May 26th he was at 3%. And Ghalibaf was 30% on May 26th. For me, as in 2009, the debates, the interviews that were on television, these mattered. The endorsements in particular of Hashemi and Khatami mattered. There was sort of reasoned decision-making by people. People were paying attention. In other words, Rouhani had to earn people's votes. He had to show that he was electable. And he won on 3 very clear, I think, points. He won on fixing the economy. That was the major and most important thing. These are all related, by the way. He won on, as has been mentioned, restoring Iran's name and position in the world. Again, this was emphasized by many, many people, that Iran had become, it was an embarrassment for a lot of people that Iran's name had been blackened in the world because of Ahmadinejad, obviously. And then finally, this is sort of the foundation of all these comments, rejecting and ending 8 years of Ahmadinejadism, if that is an ism. Maybe I just made that up. People wanted to move on. And by the way, where you see the yellow line is Rouhani over there. And so the 10th and 11th of June, the 11th is where the endorsement of the 2 leaders, Rafsanjani and Khatami, occurred. And you can see the spike, and Ghalibaf is the red line at the top. So you can see where they crisscrossed just before the election, right? There was still a great number of undecided voters. Okay, so just to finish up, so there was difference between the candidates, as Rouhani had to win votes, Ghalibaf had to lose votes. He ran a campaign emphasizing national defense, sort of this holy defense of Iran. I think this was a major miscalculation. Instead of emphasizing his credentials as a technocrat, he decided to emphasize his, I guess, what he presumed to be his base, the sort of religious side of the Iranian population. And then finally, as I think Suzanne made a good point, I'll just end on this. I think 2013 was basically the conclusion of the election in 2009. I think there's an understanding between the population and the system that Iran cannot become a Syria. Iran cannot become an Iraq or Afghanistan. That for now, this is how change in politics is going to occur through this incremental process of election. So the system allowing Rouhani to win, to participate and to win, and the decision to participate, I think, is premised on this sort of implicit agreement between the state and its society. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Very vivid picture of the elections that took place on the ground. And finally, then we'll go to Bijan, who will speak about the Rouhani and the Iranian economy.
Thank you very much. Grateful to Harle and the Woodrow Wilson Center for the invitation. And it's an extremely tough act to follow. I have no pictures in my presentation. I have a couple of graphs that may entertain you in a couple of minutes. But basically, I'll spend the next 15 minutes talking about the Iranian economy, identify the key challenges that the new administration will face, talk about some of the potential approaches that may emerge. Team members are also important, and then offer some prospects. As usual, those of you knowing me, I always put up a table with the latest statistics. Just to underline, these statistics are produced by independent economists. They are not official statistics of the Iranian government. A couple of them are official, but they are highlighted. The red figures are the problematic figures in Iran. So, I mean, you see in real terms, the GDP is growing. These are, by the way, the left two columns are the two previous Iranian years, and the right column is the projection for the current Iranian year. So you see there is, in real terms, there is a moderate, low to moderate growth of about 3%. But when you translate that into US dollars, the Iranian GDP actually declined in the past 2 years. And consequently, the first red lines, the GDP per capita declined enormously. In 2011, it declined by about 18%. In 2012, by about 34% in dollar terms. But this year, because of the new strength of the Iranian rial, which is a consequence, I will show you in a minute, of the election of Rouhani, there will be a sort of a new per capita GDP growth and also GDP growth in Iran. But basically the economy has collapsed and is trying to come back. It depends also on a number of policies. Inflation continues to be a major problem. You see the figures here. The figures in brackets are the inflation figures produced independently. The figures outside brackets are official inflation. So even official inflation is hitting 30% this year, and unofficially it's close to 40%. And Rouhani, very interestingly, in his speech to the Iranian parliament last week, he mentioned the figure of 42% for inflation. So his team tends to agree with the independent economists right now. The success story of Iran, despite all the sanctions and all the problems, is that the country continues to produce a trade surplus. And the blue line you see here, I mean, those, I won't go through all the oil and gas exports that have obviously declined. But when you look at the combination of trade, oil and gas, non-oil, and imports, Iran continues to produce a trade surplus projected this year to be about $50 billion. This is significant for Iran because even though some of these resources cannot be repatriated into the country because of the sanctions, you know, Iran is actually keeping hard currency or sometimes local currency accounts in major exporting countries, especially oil exporting countries, China, India, Turkey. Some of them, that money cannot be repatriated, but it belongs to Iran. I mean, it can be used in specific situations. So the only good news on the economic side is the trade surplus, and in fact, the government has actually announced that the main goal is to achieve a balanced non-oil trade. So they want to take out the oil and gas out of the trade figures and balance the non-oil exports against imports, which is obviously still a challenge, but it's actually possible, especially because exports are growing. The other two red lines, unemployment remains high and will remain high for some time to come, especially because of demography and budget deficit. Basically, Ahmadinejad is handing over the government with an $18 billion budget deficit this year. Obviously, it's a major challenge, especially considering the fact that there are also a lot of other debts and issues that the government has. So the new administration is going to face a major challenge. Quick look at the market's reaction to the Rouhani election. This is very interesting. The dollar, the free market rate of the Iranian dollar was close to 37,000 riyals on the day before the election, and it fell to about 30,000 riyals within a week. And that, you can say, was the psychological impact of the market players to the election. I included this to show you the last time a similar drop happened was just before the US elections in October, November last year. And back then, the psychological impact was there was a hope that if President Obama is re-elected, there may be an opportunity for a de-escalation in external relations. So you can see the psychological impacts are not just related to domestic affairs. This was an external affair. Here, this was Almaty 1. This was when there was some hope for a nuclear settlement or resolution. Then it went up, collapsed, and then it came back when there were new congressional sanctions on Iran again. So, and now it's easing a bit because everyone is looking forward towards a Rouhani government and those policies, but in my view, it won't move far away from here. I think the realistic price for the Iranian rial or for the US dollar in Iranian rials is about 32,000 rials. Many economists have confirmed that, and I think the free market rate will remain there. Any addition to it for now will be only psychological. So what are the challenges? First of all, I mentioned high inflation. Inflation is going to remain a problem. Iran is right now what the economists call in a stagflationary trap. Basically, we have stagnation, we have inflation, and there are a number of issues that cannot be just erased from the current situation. The subsidy reforms have started, they have to be continued. Subsidy reforms do have inflationary impacts, and managing all of these challenges will take time. Unemployment, I mentioned that Rouhani in a couple of statements and interviews has mentioned that this is his highest priority. But again here, it's going to be extremely difficult to find sustainable solutions, especially, again, don't forget Iran has a young population. Iran is going through the transformation with the subsidy reforms, which are making a lot of people unemployed. Lack of investor confidence. There is the two terms, Ahmadinejad experience in Iran has certainly increased the level of mismanagement, the level of corruption. I wrote in an article that Iran's corruption has gone from under-the-table corruption to over-the-table corruption. We really have over-the-table corruption and very clear over-the-table corruption. Pushing that back, again, sort of giving some confidence to the investors is going to be a long-term process. It's not, I mean, you can see from the reactions that there is some hope, but it's going to be a challenging task. Obviously, sanctions, Ali and Suzanne talked about it. It's going to be, again, difficult to manage this. But to be fair to Rouhani, Rouhani had a very realistic statement. He said, my first goal is no new sanctions. So he realizes, pushing back the current sanctions is going to be difficult. But maybe it's desirable to achieve a level where there are no new sanctions, no new complexities. And I think that's one statement that people should listen to very clearly here. Budget deficit, I mentioned. But the budgetary situation of the government is very challenging. If we have time in the question and answer session, I will go into more detail. But the government has left high levels of debt to Iranian subcontractors, to Iranian power generators, for example, to municipalities. Part of the government budget is to pay dues to municipalities. They haven't done that, and are leaving all these debts to the next administration. I mentioned these debts. Subsidy reforms. We know this is a law. It has started. The parliament has delayed phase 2 of the subsidy reforms, but they will have to be implemented. I mean, there is no way around it. If managed well, you can manage some of the inflationary impact. But again, a lot has to be revamped in Iran. Lack of investment and technology, especially in the petroleum sector. The petroleum sector requires a lot of investment. It does face a lot of challenges, not just sanctions, but also lack of technology, also lack of actual investment in some of the ongoing projects. This will be another challenge. And a final challenge is the collapse of the domestic industry. The Iranian industry suffered for a long time under misplaced, foreign currency policies in Iran. The rate of the dollar, when it collapsed in 2012 or late 2011, it had an unrealistic rate. A lot of economists were saying that. The rate of about 10,000, 11,000 riyals to the dollar in late 2011 was wrong. It was making imports, especially on the wrong trade policies, imports much cheaper compared to domestic products. And on top of that came the subsidy reforms, all the challenges, higher energy bills. And this will be a major challenge to readdress the issues and the needs of the domestic industry. Now, what could be Rouhani's or the Rouhani government's approach to the economy? This is all taken. One thing that obviously most of you know is Rouhani has been the head of the Strategic Research Center in Tehran for the past 2 decades. And the Strategic Research Center has studied a number of issues in Iran. It's not that Rouhani comes with a sort of blank sheet of paper. There have been a lot of very serious studies, and a lot of the ideas that I'm mentioning here are from that center. There is obviously a hope that through some creative diplomacy, there would be some sanctions relief. I know that it's difficult, but I know that this is the desire that the new administration will bring in. There is already a study or thoughts in the direction of shifting the cash handout policy. Right now, one of the inflationary drivers in Iran is the cash handouts. Basically, the subsidy reforms involved a number of direct cash handouts to the citizens. And there are other ways. There are non-cash ways you can do that. You can create, you can create a system with debit cards, and people can spend their balance on the debit card in specific shops, and that would be a help to the population without injecting a lot of cash into the economy. They're already talking about it. Giving more independence to the Central Bank of Iran, one of Ahmadinejad's biggest problems and mistakes has been to instruct the central bank about interest rates, about exchange rates, and it was, I always say, it was an engineering approach. Ahmadinejad had an engineering approach to the economy, which we all know always fails. Reviving the management and planning organization, this was one of the first things that Ahmadinejad did 8 years ago. He actually dissolved the management and planning organization, saying this is old bureaucracy and it's not useful anymore. Now we know it had actually a major utility because it coordinated between the different development projects across the country. And what Ahmadinejad produced in these 8 years was a lot of provincial trips, a lot of commitments in provinces, a lot of projects that started but never finished. So it's another challenge that a lot of projects, a lot of government investments are actually in unfinished businesses and unfinished projects. some short-term and long-term solutions to issues such as inflation, unemployment, housing. There are obviously a lot of ideas here. I don't have time to go into detail. There is a lot of reference in Rouhani's discourse about a law that has already been passed by the Iranian parliament called the Law on the Continuous Improvement of the Business Climate. Ahmadinejad completely ignored it, but you could always say that it was the end of his administration. But to implement this law means to remove all the obstacles that the private sector faces in the business climate, legal obstacles, economic issues, and so on. And going back to what economists call the pro-GDP growth policies that actually have been envisaged in the current 5-year plan, the 5th 5-year plan, but again, things that the Ahmadinejad administration preferred to ignore. They were more focused on their very populist agendas. A couple of words on teams. Obviously, these are speculations, but I think it's important. And before I mention the names in a table, I want to say one thing. There are two important things about the people who will probably join Rouhani in his government. One is a lot of them come from the Center for Strategic Research. This is very important because these are people who have been studying the problems of Iran, issues, foreign policy, economic, and so on. So they come with some knowledge. I mean, in the case of Ahmadinejad, some of the ministers were former governors from provinces who had never even worked in Tehran. And they came and they were suddenly given the task of managing the country. These are the people who are emerging in the new government are a different caliber. The second most important thing, and for me, very, very important, these people don't just bring back their experience from the previous governments. They also bring into the equation the experience of 8 years being outside the government. And this is very important in Iran. You have to be outside the government to feel how the government... No, some of them were only 8 years. Yes, some were 16 years. But you have to be outside the government to know what the government behavior causes for the non-government. And these people have seen that. The people Roberto was talking about who sat in the corner of in an office, corner office in a university, they know how painful it is what sometimes the government does for the non-government. And that experience, I think, will be very important. With that in mind, some names, these are speculations. Vice President is mentioned, Mohammad Reza Aref, even though he says it's hasn't been officially offered to him, but I think it would be the best choice, someone who already knows the business of the government, who already knows the bureaucracy. Former Deputy Minister of Petroleum, Mr. Nematzadeh, is mentioned as a potential Minister of Petroleum. He's a very, very interesting guy, very courageous, a good technocrat, and any success that you have seen in the Iranian petroleum sector, the petrochemical story, the refining story, and so on, where all happened under his guide, you can say. Mr. Nobacht has been the head of the economic division in the Center for Strategic Research. Very, very intelligent person, very, well researched on economic issues. One of the most intelligent moves, in my view, because he wants to promote the private sector, is bringing Mohammad Nahavandian. Mohammad Nahavandian is the current president of the Iran Chamber of Commerce. So he's the representative of the private sector. And there is talk that he may be the next Minister of Trade and Industry. Some also say that Nahavandian may become the new first vice president. This is very interesting, the suggestion. Velayati as a potential chief nuclear negotiator, that would be also very intelligent, in my view. Again, someone who is close to Mr. Khamenei, who knows the international scene, commands English, all of these things that Jalili didn't have. Could suddenly unite in a new person. Foreign Ministers, Mahmoud Voizi, again, the head of the international division at the Center for Strategic Research, again, former deputy foreign minister. There is talk of offering the position, the very, very difficult and complex position of the Ministry of Interior to Ali Akbar Natir Nouri, the former parliament speaker, current head of the audit of the Supreme Leader's office. And Minister of Intelligence, two former ministers. They're interesting choices. So I'll outlook and then a couple of prospects. I believe the economy will definitely benefit from the change of government. Just the fact that new people come in who are not going to go into a trial and error mood that the Ahmadinejad government has been in for years. But restoring economic normalcy is going to be a longer term, medium to long term project. It cannot happen over months. I mean, the excitement is there, and in fact, I believe there are some unrealistic expectations from the new government, which may create some disappointment. High inflation will remain because of the subsidy reforms and real devaluation, but at least the new government may be able to contain that. Inflation, as I said, my prediction is will be 27% this year and maybe a bit lower, but still very high. Obviously, even a 20% inflation is very high. Economic growth will depend a lot on the nuclear negotiations. Obviously, both the sanctions but also the general mood in the country will play a major role. Value of the real I mentioned in my analysis, and also other economists believe that the 32,000 reals is more realistic. So you see the market, even when it goes below 32,000, it actually always comes back, because then the players realize that it's there. There will be a positive impact on job creation, especially because of the private sector. The private sector is the main provider of jobs in the Iranian economy. And if Rouhani implements the law I mentioned and improves the business climate, it will definitely be positive for the overall outlook. So let me conclude. I believe Rouhani can reverse some of the negative developments that emerged under Ahmadinejad. Definitely, we will see a set of more pragmatic policies and more pragmatic approaches. Already the inclusion of Mr. Nahavandian and the Chamber of Commerce and private sector in the cabinet is a sign of pragmatism. I mean, compare the first moves by Ahmadinejad and the type of people who emerged 8 years ago and with what Rouhani is doing. It will have an impact. The focus will be the economy, and as I just mentioned in my comment, under that pretext, obviously, with that context, that we need the economic development, we need economic growth. This will be the main argument to revisit some of the nuclear strategies as well. I think if there is an opening and where Rouhani can actually influence the process and the debate, the entry point is the economy. Velayati, I already mentioned, if he emerges, I think he will be able to produce ideas. And those of you who watch the debates, you know that Velayati actually mentioned and actually attacked Jalili at one point, saying, in 2006, we produced a solution, but you didn't allow it to happen. So there have been solutions and ideas that can be revisited. Obviously, sanctions relief will be important, but even without sanctions relief, I think it will be very important to encourage the business, the trade that is already legitimate. There is a lot of legitimate business under the current sanctions regime that's not happening right now, because people are just scared of Iran and scared of the banking sanctions. And I think the Rouhani diplomacy could pave the way for some of the legitimate business to take place. Why do we have problems in the pharmaceutical sector? And that may require some coordination and collaboration from this side. I already mentioned Mohammad Nahavandian. The Iranian economy is not going to get rid of some of the negative phenomena like high inflation, unemployment, and so on, but obviously the choice of people and the policies will be different. And I want to end on one note, because I was hoping that it would be outlined by the other speakers, but I just want to highlight two of them alluded to it very briefly. There is a major difference between Rouhani's government today and Khatami's government 16 years ago. We forget that Khatami's government was actually a single faction government. It was even the pro-Khatami people were even attacking Rafsanjani, were excluding Rafsanjani and his network. Rouhani is the first Iranian president who can rely on a number of networks, on the Khatami network, on the Rafsanjani network, on his Center for Strategic Research network, and that is unique, and that will pave the way for a number of solutions in Iran. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bijan. And on that, I think maybe a positive note, I can open the floor to questions. Yeah.
Faye Mokhtar, no affiliation. My question was to the former panel, but Ali got into a little bit more detail about the congressional sanctions. My question to you is, if I'm sitting at the table on the Iranian negotiation team, give me one or two immediate sanction reliefs economically, or a goodwill gesture from the American side that would expedite this negotiation to go on. Since these congressional sanctions will take forever to be uplifted, have to go to the Congress, and as you went into detail, that they're very, very difficult. So what can you give me if you're sitting at the American, you're an American negotiating team and I'm Iranian, give me one or two immediate economic relief on the sanctions. Thank you.
Actually, when before Almaty 1, when I was studying the sanctions, I came up with several ideas, and to be honest with you, they were more or less what was offered in Almaty, because at the end of the day, as I said, if you want to start with confidence-building measures, there's not much that could be put on the table. I mean, petrochemical sanctions, petrochemical is important, is the second most important, as Bijan was saying, export of Iran. It's not insignificant. And in petrochemical sanctions relief, the administration was also sending a strong signal to the Iranians, which they completely missed. Gold sanctions were not yet into effect. But petrochemical sanctions were, and the administration was sending a signal that I'm willing to challenge, face up Congress on sanctions that are already in place. But other than that, to be honest with you, I don't think there is much that could be done as small steps, and that's why maybe a more for more option would satisfy the two sides more, because you can put something related to oil and financial sanctions. Otherwise, I mean, if we go with a very, very incremental, small approach, I don't think we can do much more than it's already on the table.
We have other members of the panel that wish to comment on this, but I'd please ask you to be brief, because there's many questions. Yeah.
I would say, I mean, this is not my portfolio, but I think medicine would be very important and significant. You hear this a lot. I mean, people did
that. Yeah, sure. But there are no sanctions on medicine.
But the
can I say a related thing? The best and most feasible solution, maybe starting from Europe and then from the States, is just to appoint one or two clean banks, so-called clean banks. And you can do that. You can watch that bank and the transactions between that bank and Iran very carefully, that it's within the defined perimeters. And that would facilitate, that's what I just meant. Increase the legitimate business. There is so much potential. I mean, EU and Iran, despite all the sanctions, had a trade of 12 billion euro last year, the EU and Iran. But if there would be a bit of flexibility, a couple of clean banks, that could go up to 20 billion euros without any hesitation. What I'm doing is basically excluding all the oil that is sanctioned and everything else, because the year before it was 27 billion euro. So increase that and show to the Iranian side that it makes a difference. The behavior right now is it doesn't make a difference who is president. So why should the Iranians bother to change anything?
My understanding is that's not a very attractive option for the administration, because it's kind of giving monopoly to one or two banks, which is not very attractive to them. On the question of medicine, I think we're going to hear some new initiatives in the near future, but that's not really economic relief. It's more humanitarian.
Banks were going to be doing the transaction, the financial transaction of these medical supply, are not honoring the Iranian banks. So that again is going to be a good gesture, but if you try to implement it, it's still very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
How do you have yes.
I have
Roberto,
a question.
did you have a comment?
Roberto,
No.
do you want to comment on that?
Well, just one short comment. You know, sanctions escalated from UN sanctions, which were focused on the nuclear capacity, and on sanctions against the economy, But this shift has happened, and it's difficult to reverse it. That would be the only maintaining focused sanctions would be something, of course, conducive to the, but it's very late in the game.
Joe Gildenhorn, is there a real concern with the new government about a possible strike by Israel or the United States? This was not discussed at all here. Military strike.
Is there a concern?
Question
Is there
on the Iranian
by the
side?
by the Iranian
I would
government?
actually defer to those who've been there more recently.
You know, the sanctions regime was very noticeable. The hostility towards Americans that I'd never experienced before, and the question came up repeatedly to me by all sorts of Iranians: is the U.S. really going to attack Iran? And I'd never heard this sort of question before. And this is before the election, so I imagine there's a sort of elimination of that fear, perhaps.
But that's popular opinion. What about,
Sure.
do you think Khamenei or the Revolutionary Guards believe that the threats of military action are real?
I'm not certain about that, yeah.
Well, I can maybe comment on that. My understanding is that the Iranians are cautious, but not too concerned about this. Cautiousness, you can see it in their actions on the nuclear issue, for example. They've been very careful with the Israeli red line. But not being concerned is because they simply believe that Israel doesn't have the way and the U.S. lacks the will at this stage for a military confrontation. So they're not taking it seriously, at least now.
Can I
Ali?
ask my question? Do you think, and this question is to the panel because every one of you are an expert on Iran, so we have divided you domestic and foreign policy, but that's not the case. Are the security organizations going to put any challenge to Rouhani like they did with Khatami, or are they going to sit back and let him open up and follow the policy that he has promised? Because there was no mention of them at all. And I think in 20 years of running meetings on Iran, this was the first time that I didn't hear about Revolutionary Guard, security organizations, nothing. Have they disappeared?
The bad news is they haven't disappeared. No, there was a very interesting interview with one of the commanders of the Revolutionary Guards in the newspaper Sharq. Those of you reading Persian, I encourage to read that because it is very, very illuminating. He talks about all the different, the relationship between the IRGC and all the different governments since Rafsanjani up to today. And he says in his own way, he says very clearly, he says our red line is, there are two important red lines. One is observe the laws. So in other words, what he's saying, we don't report to you, we report to the leader, we are not subdued to the government. The second issue, he said, is if we feel that our national security is endangered, then we will come into the picture. In a very interesting way, for the first time, the way I saw it for the first time, he argued that the entry of the Revolutionary Guards into the oil sector, very interesting argument, was because they saw that because of inaction of the government, Qatar and others were taking more out of shared fields from Iranian gas and oil resources. And that's when he said we made a strategic decision to enter into the, you can always argue whether this was the real reason. So observing the law and basically not compromising our national security, these are the red lines of the Revolutionary Guards, and they have. It was very interesting. Within a day, the command of the Revolutionary Guards congratulated Rouhani and said, "We will cooperate fully with the new government." When you say security forces in Iran, there is no unity. You have lots of divisions and lots of agendas. And for example, one of the former speakers here, Kevin Harris, in his latest piece has said that even some of the security people and the Revolutionary Guards were actually in favor of Rouhani and voted for Rouhani. And I can believe that. But what will happen in the security guards is that those forces, the network that came to power because of the Ahmadinejad camp, will now be pushed back. It won't happen again within one day, and there will be a lot of opaque relationships. But you can already feel, I mean, with your own opening remarks, when you say they are now less strict on dress code. Or another funny story is one of the challenges, Sherwin mentioned the football, the World Cup, but another important event for Iranian sports was the Iranian national volleyball team did very well in the World League for the first time, and even beat Italy and Serbia and so on. And they were showing live images from the game in Italy. The top of, I mean, Roberto can say how women look in Italy at the height of summer. Usually the Iranian TV shows everything with a 7-10 second delay so that they can censor these scenes. Well, there was no censorship this time, you know, and I think the censors had gone home and said, our time is up, you know, we can. So it's like some of these layers will disappear, but the overall system will be there.
Yeah, I have a short comment. You know, the other red line, if we talk about security, is not only external security. Those kind of people don't want anarchy. It's not that they belong to a party that's fundamentalist, that is right-wing against austerity. They are everything, just like the rest of the country. But they react when they think there is going to be disorder. And I think a figure like Rouhani, it gives them a little more confidence that there will not be confusion. And, you know, the regime couldn't afford a 2009 again. It cannot afford. But the opposition cannot afford 2009 again either, because it's just a big effort and you don't reach the goal. So this is important. As for possible future contradiction, I see them rather in the economy, because right now the Iranian economic system, I think, is definitely not socialist, but it's a funny case of capitalism without the free market. It's corporatist, and the IRGC benefits from a corporatist state. If it is true, and I think it is true, that the private dimension, the real competition, will be pushed, maybe there can be some contradiction with economic interest of the IRGC, not political interest.
Yes.
Hi, Peter Fettner. I'm a student at SAIS. I'm wondering if a milder president in Iran is a threat to Netanyahu and more extremist factions in Israel, and if we'll see Netanyahu, you know, sort of make a bid to cause trouble, to cause problems. I mean, this is sort of a blow to him, is it not? And if that's true, then to respond adequately to this new opportunity, doesn't America have to sort of talk to Israel? Don't we have to kind of reset our relationship with them a little bit? I could see some panic here. If Ahmadinejad is gone, then where's the major threat, and what is he going to protect Israel from? Is this a concern at all?
Anyone? Well, I think yes. I think Netanyahu very clearly sees the emergence of a moderate president in Iran as a threat, in the sense that what he sees as the Western kind of guards against Iran's nuclear program will be lowered. And we can see from his rhetoric, he's doing his best to define Rouhani as simply, you know, no real change and one of them. I think it's a case we're seeing moderation on the part of the Iranian government as a danger, because Iran then might be let off the hook on sanctions or on its nuclear program.
I would just like to add that I will quote an Iranian friend who, following the well-known Iranian tendency to accept conspiracy theories, said, I think that Ahmadinejad is a Mossad agent.
Yes. I'm sorry. Yes.
No, I think we have to be realistic. There is a tremendous capacity to demonize Iranian leaders, irrespective of precisely where they fall on the ideological spectrum. But I believe quite strongly that American policy is made here in Washington. that the distinction between interests and alliances is one that is the administration is quite capable of making. And ultimately, if there is a diplomatic agreement to be had with Iran, and I think there is, as a number of us have said, still not 100% certainty that is in fact the case for a variety of political reasons. The administration is going to be prepared to do that. I don't think to get the deal with Iran, we really need a reset with Israel.
Milton Honig, International Center for Terrorism Studies. What about those questions posed by the International Atomic Energy Agency about Iran's past activities, which are really very directly related to designing a nuclear weapon? How will answering those questions be negotiated away? I mean, so far, talks between Iran and people from the IAEA have gotten nowhere. And I'm just wondering if there's some way of negotiating away the answers to that. What do you think might be done?
Well, I think resolving problems with the IAEA is a chicken and egg dilemma, sort of, because if you don't resolve the problems with the IAEA, you can't get an agreement with the P5+1. But without political incentives from the P5+1, Iran also has no motivation to resolve problems with the IAEA. I mean, if they're not sure that if they come clean of past wrongdoings would not result in more punishment instead of alleviation of pressure, they're not going to go forward with their discussions with the IAEA. And I think that was the message before the elections. There were 10 rounds of talks, and the Iranians were trying to show to the P5+1 that we're on the verge of signing an agreement with the IAEA. We just need the political reward to come from the P5+1 because the IAEA can't provide any kind of reciprocation for Iran. And there is, I know it's a very bad model, unfortunately, to use, Libya. But when Libya came clean of its past wrongdoings, it was because there were secret negotiations, and it was because there was a grace period, basically. Libya's past activities were reported to the Security Council, but only for information purposes, not for new sanctions and punishment. So I think Iranians need to know that in advance, that there is going to be a similar grace period. And the IAEA has 13 questions, I think, from Iran based on November 2011 report. Those could be pegged to sanctions relief. Those could be pegged to normalization of Iran's dossier at the IAEA and its return from the Security Council to the agency. I think one of the downsides of just playing a waiting game at this stage from the P5+1 perspective is that precious time is being wasted. We know that devising such a roadmap that would match concessions with rewards is not easy. It's going to be very difficult. It needs a lot of coordination internally within the P5+1 members and also with allies. And that process has to start. The sooner it starts, the better. If we go into discussions with Iranians with multiple offers, with ideas, I think we have a much better chance of success than just going in and waiting for the Iranians to make the first move.
Thank you. Here, please.
Thank you all. I am Hussein Saifzadeh. I am a Perch professor from Tehran University, but I worked with Mahmoud Waezi, and I've been at the center for 16 years. And at that time, I was fired also. Then they invited me to go over there and to work with them. So knowing Ahmed, knowing Rouhani, and knowing all of them, Toscani knows we have been together. Okay, that Rouhani was the person that Khamenei sent to Rafsanjani and told him not to run. Now, my question is very specific, and is that I didn't hear anything about human rights. The political society in Iran is very important. And you see all Khatami's 2009 and now, you see the political society has changed, not economic society has changed. Would you tell me what would be the impact on that? on Rouhani's, although I know a little bit because I know him in person, and what would the reaction of the United States would be. I think in 2002 I was here and I asked him, don't go too far. If you go too far, then it react. They wanted me to go to Congress. I was scared because I was under pressure at that time to talk about that. But now I think that what I hear is that United States, as Ali says and Suzanne says, that there's no way that Americans are doing anything beyond Almaty. Don't you think that this would really have adverse impact on Iran? Thank you.
Yes, Roberto.
You know, the relationship between human rights and the nuclear issue is somewhat perverse. In a way, it has been that since we were talking just about that nuclear thing, human rights kind of faded. But there is also another problem. Strangely enough, there are people who are saying that we should not negotiate with the Iranians because there are human rights violations, which really, again, I confess, having been shaped by the Cold War, but we were able to negotiate with the Russians on START and on trade and on everything, and attack and criticize the Soviet Union for human rights. It's totally possible. So I hope that people will start understanding. As for what can happen now under these conditions, I think there are, first of all, Iranian society has grown immensely in terms of demands for civic and human rights. And history will recognize that Khatami was extremely important for that, in spite of all the shortcomings, the political failures, but that is something that will not go back. And the demand is there, and the government will have, for instance, you know, minor details like the way people walk in the street. Those things are the easy ones, but I think they will be pursued. Second, culture. I have a lot of friends who work in the Iranians, who work in, for instance, the movie, in the cinema area. They are becoming, they were very negative. Some of them had been prohibited from working, even without being sanctioned by a tribunal or anything. And now they are cautiously optimistic. So more space for culture, less pressure on lifestyle issues. That's the way the human rights discourse can start in a concrete way.
Just add one quick thing. I think there, you know, obviously is going to be real pressure over the status of Mousavi and Zahra Rahnavard and Karoubi. This was a clear demand, as Shirveen said. The vast majority of what he was hearing were in fact the slogans of 2009. And if Rouhani cannot deliver on something tangible there, it seems as though there will be a lot of frustration.
And on Mousavi, and he may well not be able to deliver, and therefore will have to deliver elsewhere, and therefore the role of the security agencies, how much room they will give him becomes very important.
I think first of all there are rumors. Obviously, Iran is full of rumors, and this is one of them.
Yes.
That on the occasion of the Eid al-Fitr, which will be the end of the Ramadan month, so in about less than 20 days, Mousavi and Karoubi will be freed. But obviously, it can happen, it cannot happen. I think Khamenei wants them to go in person to Khamenei and ask for forgiveness, and I guess at least Mousavi may not do that. So we have to see. But I think we should treat that as a signpost. All of us that are sitting here and saying, oh, Rouhani has no power and he cannot change anything, if that happens, then we should start giving more credit to Rouhani. Because I think, and this is, I think, the only way we can work with Iran. Define some signposts, say what is possible, what's not possible, but if the impossible happens, then obviously we are faced with a new situation in Iran.
I'm going to take one more question. Yes.
Hi, Christopher Knight from George Washington University. In the run-up to the election, Thomas Erdbrink, the Tehran bureau chief for the New York Times, put out an article where he wrote about the frustration amongst the youth population and how they can't, break through the glass ceiling. And my question's for Dr. Malikzadeh. If so, a year or two down the line, if a lot of these issues like high inflation, high unemployment don't become resolved, you know, the youth population in Iran, which is like 70% of the population, is under the age of 30. You know, how will they respond, you know, to the continuing like stagnation and the inability to break through that glass ceiling? Will they just kind of suffer in silence, or you know, how do you see that playing out?
This is a great question. This is more, you know, my area of research is education. You have a very interesting phenomenon in Iran occurring in Iran that you also see here in the United States, you see in France, where young people are, educated young people are amongst some of the most unemployed parts of the population. So then that raises the issue or the puzzle, why do people persist in pursuing not just a bachelor's degree, but now you're seeing, you know, sort of a arms race, if you will, education race towards a master's and even a PhD. And this has become, you know, very acute in Iran. And it's unclear why young people are doing this. There's sort of a hope or ambition that greater education, and it is true that in the long term, as in the US, that the more educated you are, the more likely you are to be employed. So this is sort of a roundabout way of answering your question by saying that this is I don't think young individuals and their participation in the economy, they see it as tied necessarily to a single individual. They recognize, I think, that there's a, you know, sort of economic, more complex economic structure that they're a part of, and that there are problems with that economy that is not allowing them to become successful. That being said, I think there is, it was very clear in the testimonials of young people and their decision to participate and support an Aref or a Ghalibaf even, and certainly a Rouhani, is that, you know, they were very interested in having an end to mismanagement, to bringing people who are, you know, there's a saying in Iran that you hear often, nobody's in their right place, right? And there's this idea or hope that with the election of Rouhani, that the right people will be put, hopefully, in the right places. I think this notion of cautious optimism, though, I would really emphasize that. I think there's been a lot of talk about, you know, the disappointment of people, the disappointment of young people if things don't change immediately in a year or two. I would push back against that a little bit. I think, you know, 16 years is a long time, and people have learned a lot, and I'm going back to Khatami now. You know, it's not that people go and vote and hope that everything, or assume that everything is going to be better. I would give them perhaps a little bit more credit. I think people understand when they vote that we're moving in the right direction. That's sort of the goal, but not that things will be fixed immediately. So I think there will be more patience than perhaps you're expecting on the part of the young people.
I agree with everything Sharon said. I think there are two other aspects. One, the Iranian people also get excited about some of the changes that Roberto was talking about in the field of culture, arts. Sharon mentioned sports. It's amazing, since Rouhani's election is obviously a coincidence, but every single sports event has gone Iran's way. You know, Iran qualified for the World Cup, won in volleyball. The Iranian female football national team came second in Asia. That was like a miracle. No, seriously, that people get excited. So, as Shervin said, half allowed it. The British allowed it. Okay, good. I didn't know that. But there is one thing that I want to connect to the issue of sanctions. And you can read about that now a lot. If we get this Rouhani sort of technocratic government in, which seems to be happening, and the perception is that there is much less corruption, much less mismanagement, then the economic woes of the country will be entirely seen as the doing of the sanctions and of the external forces, not of the internal government. And there is already a civil campaign against the sanctions. Some of the Iranian economists have started this, and this will, I think, gain momentum. So there is also a feeling that if the situation is bad, it's not necessarily our government's fault. It's also the external governments who are imposing sanctions.
Thank you. Well, I think we'll all join in thanking the panel for a very stimulating presentation.
Invite you back in 3 months' time to assess the first 120 days of President Rouhani with the same panel.
Don't forget.
Of course. That's it.